Spheres of influence made a big comeback to geopolitics over the weekend with the arrest of Nicolas Maduro by the United States of America. My conclusion: the Europeans and the UK will lose out most from this seismic shift in world affairs. My name is Ian Proud. It is just past 3 o'clock on Monday, the 5th of January 2026. So, huge events over the weekend, not necessarily completely unexpected, but nevertheless shocking. The United States of America launched a unilateral military assault on the Venezuelan capital of Caracas, and in the process arrested Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and have taken them to captivity in New York, where they are likely to face um, US specific charges around possession of firearms. It's all quite odd and quite shocking, but actually, this was a massive geopolitical event. And if you want to look for the source of this event, just go and read through again the recently published United States National Security Strategy. In that, it's made very clear that the United States of America sees the Western Hemisphere, from that read, the Americas, as their sphere of influence. They plan to dominate that part of the world. I mean, they already do, but they want to make it clear to other peer competitors, notably China, to keep their hands off. Um, on the back of growing Chinese and also arguably Russian influence in Latin America over the past decade since the start of the Ukraine crisis. So the first perspective on what has happened over the weekend was that this was a massive hands off of the Americas statement by Donald Trump to the rest of the world. Now, of course, for the United States, they have the military power to kind of back up that move, but it is nonetheless a huge moment in world politics that they've chosen to do so. Whatever you consider the legal basis of the Americans' actions, unilateral actions in Venezuela, I personally consider them to be illegal. You have to situate them within their sort of wider geopolitical context and what that means for other countries and groupings of countries around the world. So I wanted to start off by looking at the core strategic interests that different countries around the world have in events that have happened over the past 3 days. Firstly, for the United States of America, despite all of the noises made about narco terrorism and that sort of thing, this move appears very much to have been driven by oil and energy security. Venezuela possesses 17 to 18% of total global oil reserves. They don't really exploit those oil reserves, but nevertheless, they're there. By essentially capturing Venezuela as a state and installing some sort of compliant government, either maintaining the existing government in a more compliant form in its relations with the US, or installing a new puppet government in its place. The US will be able to essentially kind of dominate 20% of and more of global oil reserves, and that doesn't even take into account of Canada's oil reserves, which would take up another 10% of the global total. Across the Americas, one third of proven global oil sits, and the Americans basically want to kind of decide and govern, how that is managed as a strategic asset for the United States of America. So that's the first, biggie, right there. I mean, that is without doubt the main reason why the Americans have chosen to do this. Yes, drugs being smuggled into the US has been a huge problem over decades, not just from Venezuela, but from other countries as well. Colombia, of course, but also Mexico when it comes to, fentanyl. But this wasn't really about drugs, it's about oil. Now let's look at, what strategic stake China has in Venezuela. I mean, China's been trying to kind of increase its influence, across Latin America over many years. It has been getting some oil from Venezuela, but not a huge amount. fundamentally, China doesn't have big core strategic interests, in Venezuela, per se, beyond its drive in recent years to develop links across developing nations, including in Latin America, as a counterpoint to US influence, including through, for example, the BRICS grouping. So it has geopolitical aims for Latin America, but it has less kind of core strategic interests in what happens in there in Latin America, and doesn't really secure its energy security in a significant way from Latin America, given the proximity of Russia and other kind of closer neighborly suppliers of energy to China. So China has been expressing deep concern about what's happened, but it doesn't really have a huge amount of skin in the game in terms of kind of core strategic interests, in Latin America and in Venezuela, in particular. Russia as well. Rosneft, Russian state oil company, has been building up its collaboration with Venezuela over many years. Really, take it right back to 2014 and the start of the Ukraine crisis. Russia has been building its energy partnership there. That hasn't really kind of delivered, in terms of volumes. It's been more about Russia getting political leverage in Venezuela right on the US kind of doorstep. But again, Russia doesn't have massive strategic interests in Venezuela, and the same could be said of Europe as well. Europe doesn't rely on Venezuela in any significant sense for energy. It has minimal commercial relationships, with Venezuela. There are obviously no defense ties, a politically hostile relationship given the nature of the Maduro regime, and so on. So basically, the US sees itself as the kind of dominant regional force in having strategic interests in Venezuela through its desire to acquire Venezuela's assets and to use those for global leverage in terms of energy security and energy prices, more generally. The US can position itself potentially in the future, as Saudi Arabia has done and OPEC has done in the past, as a big mover in terms of global energy prices if it can have control over Venezuelan supply and exploit that supply in the way that it hasn't been exploited in recent years. Venezuelan oil output is incredibly low, and obviously Donald Trump, wants that to increase, and obviously sees a role for US companies, in making it happen. So big bucks to be made for the Americans, but also a big role in shaping global energy prices and global energy policy too, in the future. So what has been the reaction? I mean, the most fascinating reaction, I think, has been from Europe to what has happened in Venezuela over the past few days. There's been an incredibly limp response across Europe to events in Venezuela. And despite all of the talk over the past decade of the need to uphold the rules-based international order, European leaders have avoided any direct, condemnation of the United States actions, in Venezuela, which raises questions about their motives, for doing so. Now, very clearly, the EU has very little leverage to affect, Donald Trump's decisions. That doesn't actually prevent them expressing concern and outrage about this, unilateral attack on a sovereign nation state, which is essentially what the Americans have done, but they've chosen not to do so. The only really kind of credible, reason for that, or two credible reasons for that, I think, is one is to do with Ukraine. Over the past year, European and UK policy towards Trump has been one of flattery, trying to kind of keep him on side so that he will keep the American foot in the proxy war in Ukraine. If the Europeans and the British go in hard in criticising the United States of America on the back of its attack on Venezuela, then it would undermine their leverage over Trump in terms of maintaining an ongoing war in Ukraine, setting aside issues around whether Europe can afford to pay for that war to happen, uh, and increase the likelihood that the US will settle the war in Ukraine in terms that are more favourable to Russia than they are to Europe, and that for me really encapsulates why the Europeans have been so weak. Um, on this issue of the US attack on Venezuela. I think what that means for Europe and what that means for the UK is that they will appear to be massively duplicitous in how they've kind of handled this situation. Countries around the world, in the developing world, in BRICS, in other sort of groupings, will look at the Europeans and the British and say that they've acted with huge kind of double standards. On the one hand, imposing absolutely huge sanctions on Russia on the back of the events of the war in Ukraine, but on the other hand, turning a complete blind eye to American actions in Venezuela on the back of, in the minds of many, the Europeans largely turning a blind eye and actually offering tacit support for Israeli actions, in Yemen. So there's a huge kind of credibility challenge that the Europeans face, right now in terms of their response, and I think they're handling it very, very badly, right now, and they will only kind of lose out, it seems to me, because, you know, if we stay on Ukraine for a moment, it's absolutely not clear that taking a really passive line with Trump now on Venezuela will in any substantive way alter his calculus, on the war in Ukraine. Very clearly, Trump values, a more strategic U.S. Russia reset than he values, the maintenance of Zelensky's regime in Ukraine or the continuance of a war, a hugely costly war, in Ukraine for that purpose. So I don't really see that Trump will or in fact, I think Trump will pocket, European weakness, on the issue of Venezuela, but carry on regardless, as it relates to the policy with um, towards Russia and Ukraine, and that is, it seems to me, unchanged to kind of pursue a strategic reset with Russia, to Europe's detriment, it seems to me, and you can find wording to support that assertion very much in the U.S. national security strategy, which very much has been the foundation, it seems to me at least, for U.S. actions in Venezuela in recent days. The other thing, of course, is NATO. If the Europeans kind of criticise their NATO partner, then that would just accelerate Trump's sprint to the NATO door, and see a further watering down of US commitment to NATO at a time when the Europeans are desperate to kind of maintain the proxy war in Ukraine. Uh, throw another fly into the ointment here with the US position on Greenland, where Trump has been quite clear that he wants to take over Greenland for the U.S. national security. And I don't necessarily think that he's going to act on that. I mean, the Americans have spent months putting in place a legal basis to justify their unjustifiable, it seems to me, actions in Venezuela in recent days. It's going to be far harder for them to act with any plausibly deniable kind of legal basis, in Greenland. There simply is one that exists, and it would, shatter U.S. reputation more than it's been shattered by events of recent days. To kind of make any kind of kinetic move on Greenland, not that Trump necessarily cares about that, of course, but I think we're a long way from push coming to shove when it comes to Greenland. So European leaders find themselves in a difficult position in terms of how they respond both to the situation in Venezuela and also US maneuverings around Greenland. Now, I think actually the Danish Prime Minister, who I think is actually weak when it comes to Ukraine policy, has rightfully been quite firm and strong in her statements about Greenland, forming part of one of the kingdoms of of Denmark, and I think it's right that she's done that. I mean, Keir Starmer has kind of backed that up, and other European leaders, Stubb in Finland, have done the same. And I think it's right that they did that, but that doesn't change the fact that they look weak, duplicitous, and mendacious. When it comes to Venezuela, and that's a look that won't be lost on the rest of the world. When it comes to Russia, in terms of how they position their response to the recent events in Venezuela. Now, there's been some outrage expressed in the normal channels in the Russian Duma and other places on Russian state-owned media. But I think that Putin will kind of want to handle his response to this very, very carefully. I mean, yes, Russia has been dipping its feet quite deeply into the oil wells of Venezuela over the past decade, but it's still a tiny oil-producing country, despite the fact that it has absolutely massive reserves. And I think Putin will value that kind of bigger reset with the US over getting into a massive fist fight, frankly, over US actions in Venezuela. So I think actually the Russians will play it quite cautious, in fact, and will kind of want to keep their focus on actually coming out, of the Ukraine war in terms that are most favourable to them, with Trump very much helping them to kind of facilitate that exit ramp, but actually getting distracted by a big fist fight over Venezuela, because the Russians are smart enough to know that actually legally they're in exactly the same boat in Ukraine as the US is in right now in Venezuela. Whatever the national security arguments in favour of American actions against Maduro, or Russian actions in Ukraine, internationally they are both legally questionable. The Russians will know that, and they will just settle and not make a huge deal over this. That doesn't mean that in the margins of the UN General Assembly and in BRICS, they will continue, frankly, a long-standing effort with the Chinese to kind of weaken US influence on the world stage through the international financial architecture and multilateral fora. I mean, but that is nothing. That is nothing new. I think Putin genuinely does want some sort of bigger strategic reset with the US, and he will kind of keep his eye on that prize. The Chinese have been most out there in their condemnation of the US, which comes as no great surprise. China is the United States' only sort of peer competitor, globally, and actually the optics of them coming out hard on US actions in Venezuela can work for the Chinese in the context of their shift to really building up solidarity amongst the developing world against the hegemon of the West. And I think actually American actions in Venezuela will be massively damaging to the US image, globally. And I think the Chinese will very much seek to play on that, particularly on the back of the very damaging sort of Trump tariff wars, over the past year. I don't think Trump, because in some respects he's quite short-termist in orientation, at least it seems to me. I don't think he'll care that much, about that necessarily. Uh, but I think actually China will benefit hugely, kind of politically, from this shift, and is making all the big noises right now to position itself, at the front of that argument, against yet another kind of neo-colonial move by the Western hegemon, and the need for people to group around China and other allied countries in BRICS to create alternative structures of geopolitical power. So, I mean, there's that. But I also think, actually, from the Chinese perspective, yeah, I think they will, quietly smile to themselves that the Americans are engineering consent for them to act more freely as it relates to Taiwan. Because if, frankly, the Americans can just make a move on Venezuela and Venezuela's oil assets, whatever the makeup of the government that remains in place in Venezuela when the dust settles from all of this, then it will consider that it has more freedom and leeway to act, in the South China Sea and over Taiwan. Not that it necessarily will, in the short term, but what it won't do, China, it seems to me, is take lectures from from the Americans, and definitely not the Europeans who've just completely ignored American actions in Venezuela over their kind of increasingly muscular position in the South China Sea. They simply ignore those voices more than they ignore them already. So I think Trump is helping Xi to engineer consent for more powerful Chinese actions in the South China Sea. There, you get the potential kind of rubbing point of potential future kind of warfare between China and the US, over Taiwan. I'm not entirely convinced, quite frankly, that the Americans are really going to fight China over Taiwan, not least at a time when they're staking a claim that they own the Western Hemisphere. The flip side of that argument is that the Chinese own the Far East, and I think the Americans will kind of think carefully about how far they want to kind of try and be the global dominating force, which they say they don't want to be in the national security strategy, or actually stay and dominate their part of the world. So this to me all comes back to the point I made at the start about this return of spheres of influence. Increasingly you're going to see the Far East, and the Western Hemisphere locked out. That leaves Eurasia, right in the middle, which will be, the big complex geopolitical space, in the future, with the Europeans struggling increasingly, kind of struggling, to kind of find a geopolitical role for itself at a time when Russia feels kind of, strengthened in some ways, by however the exit settlement from the Ukraine war, takes place. And as I said a moment ago, if Putin continues to kind of hedge on actually kind of not criticizing Trump too harshly in the interests of a settlement most favourable to Russia, then the outcome of the Ukraine war looks really, really bad. Actually, for Europe, both politically in terms of weakening of their kind of global influence, but also economically because of the massive costs of absorbing a shattered and dysfunctional Ukraine, kind of when the war ends. So everything that's happened over the past kind of few days for me really comes back to geopolitics more than it comes back to the kind of the tactics of dealing with drug trafficking into the United States, and dealing with a rogue dictator in Venezuela. I mean, let's be honest, there are dictators all around the world. You can argue in some democracies, including the UK, there's a form of kind of dictatorship with the state and the uniparty and the media, controlling all the narrative to the detriment of ordinary citizens. But I mean, the world is a dysfunctional place, and Venezuela is just one of the more dysfunctional countries. That doesn't create a justification to invade it unilaterally and kidnap, its leader. Well, that is the nature of geopolitics, and that's the big muscle move that Trump has decided to make. In a perfect world, everybody would live, within the UN Charter, in itself, what's set up to recognise the inherent messiness of the global post World War II settlement, where borders were contested and unclear, but countries just had to let individual sovereign governments get on with managing their own affairs, whatever political system they adopted, however oppressive or repugnant to us uh, perfumed Europeans they may appear to be, and that's the imperfect world of the perfect utopia that the UN Charter tried to create. Well, Trump has driven a big nuclear powered aircraft carrier through that, in recent days, and said, well, increasingly the United Nations Charter is going to be the past. Spheres of influence are going to be the future. This is ours. We'll fight China, over theirs, and actually, in the interest of U.S. commercial benefit, we'll try and sort of manufacture some settlement, in Eurasia, so that U.S. companies can benefit, and the Europeans can do what they will, and continue their civilizational decay. So that's how I very much see this. What happens next? What happens next is not very much because let's be clear. The Europeans have been callow and mendacious on this issue. In recent days, uh, Keir Starmer has revealed himself as even more weak and ineffectual, than he was, before, the weekend's events. He is a leader with absolutely no foreign policy ideas and even less, a geopolitical kind of clout. And this, I believe, event has just highlighted the fact that he is inept as a geopolitical player, and that the UK under his leadership is sinking further into irrelevance. And I think the same could be said of the unelected anti-democratic kind of European structures, which have fallen in line with Trump on this, Ursula von der Leyen, Kai Kallas, and the rest of them over there in Brussels. They're not going to make any kind of decisive statements against what the Americans have done. They're hoping for the best. I mean, the European policy, after this is to hope for the best that, by not criticizing Trump on Venezuela, they will keep him on side with Ukraine. But I fear to inform them that I suspect that Trump has other ideas and he still wants to kind of settle Ukraine and he wants to have that big ticket reset with Russia. What happens next for Venezuela? I mean, I think we're going to have some sort of puppet government or compliant government that the US is pulling the strings of. It's almost taking us back to the banana wars, of 80 or so, 70, 80, years ago, where the US is going to impose its kind of commercial dominance, over, over oil, in Latin America. And you know, everybody will have to get on board with that. And it's a sort of, neo-colonial mindset that drives Trump, that he has a right to do that because of the US exceptionalism and all the rest of it. And however much they complain, and they will complain a lot, Latin America will not be able to kind of resist that. So I think, Venezuela will see some sort of chaotic, reset of their domestic political settlement. Um, American companies will benefit if any ordinary Venezuelan citizens do benefit from the gradual increase in sort of oil exploration in Venezuela. Then it will happen over a very long period of time. The big beneficiaries there will be the Americans. And for China, what next? They're not going to put up a big fight about it. Uh, they're going to make a lot of noise, but not much else. I mean, their big fight really is over Taiwan. The interesting thing to watch, I think, will be today's United Nations Security Council meeting in terms of how the British and the French, position themselves, because the Chinese, in particular, and to some extent the Russians, will want to make a lot of noise about US actions in Venezuela, and the UK permanent representative in particular will not be able to kind of match it with any kind of strong words because of the line that Keir Starmer has taken, boxing the UK in a supportive, or at least implicitly supportive, line on American actions. So I think actually watch the United Nations Security Council meeting coverage today. It's going to be a huge embarrassment, for the UK, when we have nothing strong to say, no strong words to offer, on this illegal US act in Venezuela, and yeah, Keir Starmer's, standing domestically will will be affected or may be affected. I mean, it's I have to say the kind of UK media coverage has been quite weak, on Venezuela in recent days. The BBC, which increasingly acts as an arm of the UK government, has has been focusing on oppositionist celebrants around the world. Rejoicing this kind of shift to democracy in Venezuela. I'm not quite sure it's really going to turn out like that. So But yeah, but I think globally more than domestically, kind of Keir Starmer will look even weaker than he does already. And yeah, and that's how I kind of really see it all playing out. And today's a big day. Watching United Nations Security Council, meeting the theatre of Maduro appearing in court for gun possession charges, which is frankly bizarre. In the extreme, this is geopolitical for theatre, and right now, Donald Trump is playing the main role, and actually most of the supporting roles too. It's bizarre, but spheres of influence have made a big return, and he wants to dominate one of them. So I hope you found that interesting, and do keep following my Substack, which is the Peacemonger, and as I try and build up a following on YouTube, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you again.